address our Truman member, Monique Alcala.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be here today to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Maddow, and then also moderate the Q&A portion of this conference in just a little bit. This is actually really special for me. I don't think I mentioned this to her whenever we were chatting back because I was kind of scared, but I did. I moved back to Austin not a couple of years ago, and one was because my father was sick. And sadly, he passed away in October, but I remember him telling me a few years ago that he stopped watching the news because of all of the extremist rhetoric and all of the attacks on our country, except for Rachel's show. So when Truman asked me to do this, I was like, of course I am. I'm a huge fan, but also it's just incredibly extra special for me just because of that. So very thankful to Truman for asking me to do this. So let's go ahead and introduce our speaker. Rachel Maddow is the host of the Emmy Award-winning show, or the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC. It was the most successful show launched in MSNBC history, immediately boosting ratings in its time period when it debuted in September 2008. I'm sure most of you in the audience know how great the show is, I know I do, and how talented Rachel is. But did you know she's also the recipient of tons of awards and recognitions, like a bunch of Emmys? Emmys, I mean, come on. And then she was also named Breakout Star by the Washington Post in 2008 whenever the show launched. And she was also named one of the top 10 political newcomers by Politico.com. Last year, along with former Maddow Show producer Michael Yarvitz, she executive produced and launched a podcast called Rachel Maddow Presents Ultra, an 8-part historical nonfiction series that explores the story of a 1944 Great Sedition trial. It even caught the attention of Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment, which has since optioned the film rights for the podcast and will develop a feature film. Ultra is the second original podcast from Maddow and Yarvitz following their hit series Bagman, which earned the prestigious DuPont Columbia Award. In addition to all of this, Maddow is an author of several books, including Drift, The Unmooring of American Military Power, which debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in March of 2012, and Blowout, Corrupted Democracy, Rogue State Russia, and the Richest, Most Destructive Industry on Earth. Maddow received a bachelor's degree in public policy from Stanford University, and she earned her doctorate in political science at Oxford University, which she attended on a Rhodes Scholarship. She lives in New York City and Massachusetts with her partner, artist Susan Mikula. Let's welcome to the stage Rachel Maddow.
Hi. I get nervous when I can see the humans to whom I am speaking. So these are my reading glasses, and you're just an amorphous blob. And I'm sorry. So any subtle motions are like, if something's happening, you're trying to get my attention, I need big movements. Thank you for that kind invitation or introduction. One of the things I don't do very often is give speeches, and that is in part because I get nervous seeing humans. But it's also because when I have given speeches in the past, I am never invited back. And that is because I give weird speeches. So this is your fair warning. This will be a weird speech. I'm sorry in advance. I can tell you right now, you're going to have no idea why I'm talking about most of the things that I'm talking about. It is a story about bad guys, but they are bad guys you haven't heard of and that don't necessarily matter to you. It says some unkind things about our namesake President Harry Truman, which is probably a bad choice for this room. But stick with me. It wraps around, and there are no commercials, and there's no guest. All right. 1789 was the French Revolution. Typical Maddow show start, right? 1889 was the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, and there was a World's Fair that year. So naturally, they had Paris host it on the centennial. And what Paris built for the World's Fair in 1889 was the Eiffel Tower. And Parisians thought it was absolutely hideous. They were so glad it was only going to last for the duration of the fair. But that is how we got the Eiffel Tower. The World's Fair is also how we got the Space Needle in Seattle. Yeah. Seattle has nothing to do with drug use. It had to do with the 1962 World's Fair. They built the Space Needle as a centerpiece for the fairgrounds for that year. And of course, we still have it today, and it is obviously awesome. We don't really do World's Fairs anymore, not in the same way we used to, but they were a really, really big deal for a long time. In 1939, the World's Fair was in New York, and that was the World's Fair where the world was introduced to some weird new thing called television. They debuted that at the World's Fair. Also nylon, also Viewmasters. You can judge amongst yourselves which of them has had a more important impact on America in the years since. That 1939 World's Fair stretched into 1940, and if you think about what was going on in the world at that time, there was an interesting reflection of it at that World's Fair as Nazi Germany started invading country after country in Europe, and the national pavilions of all the invaded countries, one after the other, just started going black, just started taking themselves down. The first time we got those national pavilions at a World's Fair, where countries would have their own area at the fair to build things and show off what was great about their country, the first World's Fair that did that was one in Chicago in 1892. It was another anniversary. It was 400 years since Columbus sailing to the New World, so it was like discovery of America. They had all these really racist anthropological exhibits to show, what the world was like before white people got here. But they showed off the first ever Ferris wheel at the 1892 Chicago World's Fair. Chicago was super, super, super proud of how that World's Fair went, so much so that it, to this day, is on the Chicago city flag. Chicago's flag is like white with 2 blue stripes, and then it's got 4 red stars. One of the stars is for that World's Fair, like in perpetuity. It was that important to them, which is awkward because at that World's Fair, the mayor of Chicago was assassinated. Disappointed office seeker went to his house and killed him. They had to change the closing ceremony, so it was sad. Lots of things about that World's Fair make it stand out, but the national pavilions, where countries from all over the world would have their own country-specific lavish exhibits and build a thing to show off who they were, that was the real innovation that year. And that year, to represent the British Empire, the British colonies at that fair in Chicago, they constructed a huge thing, not like Eiffel Tower big, but big. It was a fake Buddhist temple, full-scale temple. They called it Ceylon Court, as in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And it was a temporary building constructed just for the fair, but it was massive. It was 18,000 square feet, so like castle size. It was built with rare hardwoods. Not a single nail was used in the construction. It was all held together with pegs. It was a big, elaborate thing. It cost $1 million to build it in 1890s dollars, so it's like $33 million today, just for this big, beautiful but weird thing that was just for the fair, and then after the fair it was slated to be demolished, which of course seems like a waste. At least it seemed like a waste to a rich real estate guy in Wisconsin. After that World's Fair was over in 1893, he paid to have this 18,000 square foot temple dismantled, packed onto rail cars, 24 different rail cars, shipped it to Wisconsin, and then had it rebuilt on the shores of Geneva Lake, in the town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And once this big 18,000 square foot temple was assembled on the shore of the lake, the real estate guy decided he did not like it, And so he sold it to a rich Chicago banker. The rich Chicago banker then promptly sold it to the Maytag family, as in the Maytag washing machine family. They made this $1 million, 18,000 square foot fake hardwood temple held together with pegs, all taken from the World's Fair. They made it part of their estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where it fit right in. Lake Geneva, by the 1920s and the 1930s, was just a real showcase for the ostentatiously rich of the Midwest. The Maytag Washington machine family had their huge fake Buddhist temple brought in by railcar from the World's Fair. The Wisconsin Historical Society will still, to this day, happily sell you postcard images of a big Sri Lankan temple incongruously perched on the banks of Geneva Lake. But other rich people in Lake Geneva had also bought and shipped the Denmark Pavilion from the World's Fair, also the Norway Pavilion. Also, for some reason, the state of Idaho had a whole building at that World's Fair, and somebody in Lake Geneva disassembled it, put it on the train, drove it to Lake Geneva, reassembled it, and they lived in the building. It was a thing. It was like Epcot Center. But this is a place where everybody was kind of outdoing themselves. You have the family that owned the Morton Salt Company. They built themselves a 13-bedroom mansion in Lake Geneva with 30-foot ceilings. The Crane family of the plumbing fixtures fortune, they built a 22-bedroom palace in Lake Geneva. There was a rich socialite novelist named Jane Eyre Fairbanks. She built a 40-room mansion there that was made to look like it was stamped out of gingerbread. Still today, among this, we're coming, don't worry. Still today, Lake Geneva is among the swankiest addresses in that whole part of the country. They call it the Switzerland of America. There's a mansion in Lake Geneva on the market today that comes, it's like $35 million, and it comes with a whole separate house on the grounds that's just for the owner's model train set. So if that's you, and you have the money to spare, Lake Geneva is for you. But so in the 1930s, Lake Geneva was definitely that era's equivalent of the show-off, lifestyles of the rich and famous kind of place. And it was also no Jews allowed. Lake Geneva is about 70 miles from Chicago, and in January 1941, the Lake Geneva Chamber of Commerce put an ad in the Chicago Daily News that said this. It said, "Come to the Switzerland of America, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Write the Chamber of Commerce for complete information, catering to a Gentile clientele." So real estate transactions were what they call restricted in Lake Geneva, which meant restricted to non-Jews only. And a lot of places were in that boat in the United States in 1941, but Lake Geneva was one of the only places that was advertising it explicitly. I mean, they were saying overtly in Chicago newspapers, "Come here, Chicago money. Here you can get away from the Jews." A few months after that ad ran in the summer of 1941, a New York magazine relocated its whole staff, its whole operation from Manhattan to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And the explanation offered by the editor was that New York City's mayor was too anti-German. The editor told Time magazine that he decided to move his magazine out of New York because of Mayor LaGuardia's yells that German bombers are coming. The decision was explained in blunter terms to a far-right newsletter called America in Danger. What they said about the move in 1941 was this. They said, "For some weeks before we left New York, our mailbags were rifled. New York has a Jew postmaster and a Jew LaGuardia as mayor." That magazine that moved, their editor told another reporter that he wanted to get his magazine out of New York and into Lake Geneva specifically instead because there was about to be a civil war in the United States in 1941. He said, as long as Roosevelt continued to drive America toward war against Hitler, Midwest farmers were going to rise up and lead a civil war, and they were going to win. Because Midwest farmers were the real heartland stock of America. They did not want to fight their blood in Europe. And the day was soon approaching when they would rise up, they would take up arms, overthrow the elites, overthrow the U.S. government to keep America from fighting Hitler. So since that day was coming soon, he figured it was better to be in Wisconsin, which was going to be the winning side in the Civil War, particularly against the East Coast. And sort of overlooked now, even I think by people who are looking at the history of that time, but lots of the more radical Americans who didn't want us to fight in the Second World War predicted we would have a civil war here if Roosevelt did get us into it. And some of them were sort of saying publicly that they feared that that might happen, but some of them were plainly kind of rooting for that. So as the magazine moved from New York to Lake Geneva, you can see, if you can find old copies of it, that it started to change as a magazine physically. It got kind of swanky. Its covers were glossy and printed in color, which was rare at the time because it was expensive. It was printed on really high-quality paper, which is a benefit for those of us looking at this history now because it survived, as opposed to pulpier publications that have dissolved over time. This is a magazine that was long. It had lots of pages. Also, interestingly, it had no visible means of support. It had no ads. It did have sort of PSAs telling readers like how to join their local America First committee, which was a big mainstream organization advocating to keep America from joining World War II. But it didn't have anything that looked like a paid advertisement at all. How was it being funded? For a flavor of what the magazine was like, this is a magazine that put Charles Lindbergh on the cover and Henry Ford, politicians like the influential Republican Senator Gerald Nye. And the editorial slant was very aggressively and very emphatically that the U.S. shouldn't join the war, that neither Germany nor Japan was any threat to us, that we should be allied with them if anything. It was pointless for our allies to even try to fight Germany in particular, which was so much stronger than everybody else militarily. It also hinted and sometimes sort of flat out said, particularly in its cartoons, that maybe here in America, it was just the Jews who were trying to get us into the war. Not because it was good for America, but because Jews always have their own nefarious purposes. Although there was no indication that there were all that many paying subscribers to this very fancy, expensive magazine, it was nevertheless printed and mailed out in huge quantities. In fact, the magazine was sent in bulk to U.S. Army bases and U.S. Army airfields and even to combat ships in port. This magazine was called Scribner's Commentator, and it showed up in bulk quantities on U.S. military posts as far afield as the Philippines and Alaska and the Panama Canal Zone. And every issue of this thing was like, Hitler's winning, possibly Hitler's right. U.S. has no hope in fighting against him, and certainly no reason to fight against him. It's being shipped out in bulk to U.S. troops in the field. Who was paying to produce this thing? Where was it coming from? In November 1941, so that same year, a special grand jury was convened in Washington to investigate the German government's secret propaganda operations inside the United States. And a writer for that magazine, for Scribner's Commentator, was subpoenaed to testify to the grand jury. There were questions for this writer about the distribution of the magazine, particularly because it was being sent to U.S. troops, questions about who was backing the magazine financially. When the writer got his subpoena, he went on the lam, and there was a national manhunt to find him. He eventually explained that he was on a sudden impulse vacation in the Deep South and had forgotten about the subpoena. He was later tried and convicted as a secret foreign agent who was on the payroll of the Japanese government. Publisher of the magazine was also invited to testify. When he was questioned as to how the magazine was funded, he had the world's most amazing story. He told the grand jury under oath that the way the magazine was funded, it's crazy, but you gotta believe me, was by anonymous gift-wrapped parcels of cash that were left as presents for him at his front door in Lake Geneva. He said on one occasion, he found inside his front hall, hurled through an open window, a parcel that was $15,000 in cash in $20 bills. It was all wrapped up like a present. He had no idea who threw it through his window. It was just laying there in the hall. Thank God he left his window open that night. Then it happened again, another $15,000, also in $20 bills, also wrapped up in gift wrap like a present, this time left just inside his front door in Lake Geneva. perspective, $15,000 then would be about $300,000 today. And there was still more. He said one day in Lake Geneva, a man on the street walked up to him and without a word handed him a parcel, $3,000 in cash. Never seen the man before, didn't know who he was. The man didn't give his name, didn't say anything, just handed him the money and walked away. And that was how they paid for the magazine. It was amazing. He said another $6,000 found wrapped up like a present just sitting on his desk one day. He had a habit of leaving his door unlocked in safe Lake Geneva. And so, who knows? It could have been anyone. But that's how he said his expensive glossy magazine was funded. Angels, maybe, right? Some sort of otherworldly benefactor. It was like winning the lottery without even playing. It's great. 4 times. The publisher explained to the grand jury that no, he was not curious about who was dropping off this cash. And he didn't see why the grand jury should see it as odd either. He explained that he was producing a magazine of such compelling quality that it didn't surprise him that anonymous benefactors would do this. But if it really was like, Santa leaving anonymous gifts at the Lake Geneva house to fund this magazine, the prosecutors who were leading the grand jury inquiry had questions they wanted to ask him about that. Because one of those big anonymous influxes of cash seemed to coincide with this publisher taking a trip to New York. In September of 1941, the guy left Lake Geneva, took a train to New York, checked into a hotel in New York, the Hotel Pennsylvania, stayed one night, then took the train back to Wisconsin the next day, and when he arrived back in Wisconsin, he went to the bank and deposited $15,000. So the prosecutor said to him in front of the grand jury, hey, in this case, it kind of doesn't look like Santa. It kind of looks like you went to New York and got 15 grand and brought it back here and put it in the bank. And he said, no, no, no. That whole trip to New York thing was just a lark. It was a big misunderstanding. It was a mistake. He insisted that actually that was just one of those gift-wrapped parcels of cash. It arrived like it always did, like a stork had dropped off a new baby. Just randomly dropped off at his house, and on that occasion, for whatever reason, it seemed like so much money, he thought, it's not safe to deposit in Wisconsin. I will buy a train ticket, take the money on a train ride to New York, put it in a New York bank, and come back here. And then when he said he got to New York, he changed his mind about it. He felt silly. So instead, he took the money on a return trip back to Wisconsin and deposited it there. That was his explanation. You will be shocked to learn it does not appear that his story was true. When the war was over in 1946, one of the prosecutors who had been investigating these Nazi propaganda efforts in the United States, he went to Germany to interview captured Nazis, because now the war was over, right? And these were high-ranking Nazi officials who had actually overseen the Hitler government's efforts to spread Nazi propaganda in the United States and to promote American fascist groups here. And so while he was in Germany, and he was doing this questioning, there were 2 Nazi officials who admitted, in fact, that they were Santa. They were the leprechauns. They were the storks, right? They had actually been providing funding from the German government in cash for that American magazine in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Also, for another broadsheet publication in Lake Geneva that took the same editorial line, but that was even more anti-Semitic. It was Nazi government-funded propaganda to try to undermine the American war effort, to promote fascism and especially anti-Semitism here, and to keep America from joining the war against the Axis powers. It was all based out of this rich, proudly anti-Semitic, no Jews allowed town in Wisconsin. One high-ranking Nazi official admitted to the prosecutor that he was the one who had approved the German government providing the funding. A second Nazi official testified that after his boss had approved it, he was the one who physically took it to the Hotel Pennsylvania and handed it over to that publisher that night in September 1941 when the prosecutors already knew that guy was there. It's a pretty good case, right? The prosecutor who collected that testimony from those Nazi officials, he came back to the U.S. and reported to the U.S. Justice Department that Lake Geneva, Wisconsin was hosting a magazine and a newspaper that were both funded by the Nazi government. The cash parcels that were used to fund the magazine so lavishly were not, in fact, just flying through the window on angel's wings. They had been delivered by Nazi officials working at the German consulate in New York. prosecutor advised DOJ that it was his recommendation that, at the very least, the publisher who had testified about these gift-wrapped parcels to the grand jury, he should be put on trial, at the very least, for perjury. And he was put on trial for perjury. And DOJ did not take any chances with this case. They actually brought the Nazi witnesses from Germany to Washington to testify in this case. The guy who admitted hand-delivering the cash, the guy who admitted approving the cash deliveries, they were brought to testify at the trial, and this was core to the substance of the case, right? So the jury was to consider, basically, which is more likely? That this, it's kind of door number one, this pro-German, pro-Hitler, inexplicably lavish, expensive magazine was funded by random anonymous gift-wrapped parcels of money thrown through windows. Or door number two, was it more likely that it was funded by the German government when two officials of that government admit that it was them? Funded by magic leprechauns or funded by Nazis who admit they did it? Which is it? The jury chose door number one. Must be leprechauns. They acquitted the publisher of the magazine of perjury charges. The jury said they did not believe he lied when he explained to the grand jury his story about the gift-wrapped parcels of cash and random guys just handing him thousands of dollars on the street and walking away without a word. They decided that was real. So first of all, this is a true story. This happened in March. The trial was March 1947. The reason the jury acquitted this guy is because the defense convinced the jury that the Nazi witnesses must have lied in their testimony. According to the defense, the Nazis must have been tortured by the Americans when they were questioned in Germany. It was only because they were tortured that they gave this false testimony, falsely claiming that the German government had funded this magazine. Now, there is no evidence at all, other than the defense's claims, that this happened. But as a defense, it worked. The magazine guy really was acquitted. And if you widen the lens just a tiny little bit, you can see why that defense might have worked. As I said, the trial was held in March 1947. For a couple of months before that, in January, February of 1947, newspapers in the United States, dozens of newspapers, including prestige papers like the New York Times, had been running story after story after story about accusations that Nazi prisoners were being abused in American custody in Germany. Nazis were being tortured by American interrogators in Germany. The line was that the Americans were behaving worse than the Gestapo ever did. They were giving these Nazi war crimes defendants the third degree and accusing them of all sorts of things they never did and exacting false confessions from them by third-degree tactics. Those accusations were false. Americans were not doing that to German prisoners. But the allegations were very scandalous, and they got a lot of play in the press at the time. Those false accusations of Nazi prisoners being abused had been invented in Germany by pro-Nazi defense lawyers who were defending accused German war criminals. And I say they were pro-Nazi lawyers because they invented these allegations not just to try to get their clients off the hook. It was part of a broader strategy. They were trying more broadly to rehabilitate the image of the Nazis, trying to discredit the Americans and the Allies, trying to make it seem like the Allies and the Nazis were all equally bad. It was just victor's justice. It was just that the Germans had lost, and so they were now getting a bad rap. In the most sinister formulation, and this was argued not just in Germany, but also by Americans here at home, in the most sinister formulation of this argument, the claim was that Jewish American investigators and interrogators were inventing terrible claims about Germans out of spite. Jewish American servicemen were out to get German soldiers for revenge because of what the Germans had done to the Jews, and just because the Germans were Christian and Jews were terrible to Christians. And so the accusation was, under color of the US military, Jewish GIs were torturing innocent Germans for their own sadistic satisfaction. And that was all complete bull. But German defense lawyers and American defense lawyers sympathetic to the Nazi defendants, they all advanced these claims. And the accusations were amplified by the conservative press here in America and by Americans here at home, including some Americans serving in the United States Senate, who were trying to get political advantage out of it by attacking the army, by attacking the administration, by allying themselves with these scandalous false claims. And it all contributed in that moment in time, in sort of late 46 into 47, to this astonishing run of commuted sentences and de facto pardons for convicted Nazi war criminals in Germany, even though there really wasn't any evidence that Americans had been brutalizing Nazi prisoners. The accusations worked, though. And after months of those false allegations circulating in the press and Congress, it helped collapse some of the Nazi war prosecutions in Germany. And this prosecution of this weird Nazi-funded magazine from Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, that prosecution in March 1947, it contributed to its collapse. Fell apart for the same reason. These false claims that the poor Nazis must have been mistreated by terrible American interrogators who were just out to get them. This deception to try to rehabilitate the image of the Nazis and smear the United States, particularly to smear Jewish Americans. It's a really ugly story. And in the moment, in March 1947, it was this big, embarrassing courtroom loss for the Justice Department. The magazine guys who had conspired with the Germans, who had taken orders from Berlin, who had so obviously been on the German payroll, they absolutely got away with it. Their editor went on to a long career at Reader's Digest after running this other magazine for the Nazis. By the end of his long career, he was retired and writing genteel, racist books about sailing to tropical islands. You can still get them today on eBay. The writer who was convicted as an agent for the Japanese, he did a short prison sentence and then went on to a long, influential career on the American hard right, promoting American support for apartheid and later Holocaust denial. The Nazi-funded propaganda operation that operated in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in that rich, well-connected, deeply anti-Semitic town, that just disappeared from history. You can buy yourself a $35 million mansion there today with a separate house for your train set. The prosecutor, though, who uncovered all of this, who got this evidence and brought it back to America, what happened to him is he was fired by Harry Truman. Did I read the room wrong? I'm okay? All right. When this prosecutor had gone to Germany and questioned Nazi officials about the work they had done in the United States, the Americans they'd funded, the Americans who they'd made plans with against the U.S. government, that prosecutor came back to the U.S. with a pretty good understanding of how Nazi Germany had operated inside our own country. He came back with a list of Americans who'd been on the German payroll or who had been working with them. And on that list of Americans were 24 serving U.S. senators and members of Congress. And on that list of serving senators was a Democratic U.S. senator who was a very close friend of President Truman. He'd been friends with him when President Truman was in the Senate himself. And that year, in 1946, President Truman had openly endorsed and campaigned for precisely one Democratic senator who was up for re-election. And it was his friend, this senator, his name was Burton Wheeler. Well, that prosecutor's report on what he had discovered in Germany, what he had learned from captured Nazis, he brought it back to the U.S. The report was submitted to the Attorney General, whose name was Tom Clark, who'd go on to be a Supreme Court justice. The Attorney General appears to have told President Truman that his friend, Senator Wheeler, was on the list of Americans who had worked with the Nazis inside the United States. Senator Wheeler then went to the White House to pay President Truman a visit. And we know from White House records at the time that they had a 2-hour one-on-one meeting. At the end of that meeting, that same night, President Truman summoned his Attorney General and told him to fire the prosecutor, the guy who had written this Justice Department report, told the Attorney General to bury the report and keep it secret, even though the prosecutor had previously been told it would be made public. The Attorney General did so. That same night at midnight, he fired the prosecutor. And now today, with the benefit of hindsight, We know that despite lots of false claims at the time, Nazi prisoners were not systematically tortured or brutalized when they were held by U.S. forces after the war, let alone subjected to some kind of sadistic revenge plot by Jewish U.S. service members. It did not happen. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that the Nazis were supporting pro-fascist efforts inside the United States. They were bankrolling pro-fascist authors and publications, supporting violent U.S. fascist groups who stockpiled weapons and planned to try to overthrow the U.S. government. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that the Nazis did have Confederates inside the United States, including a surprisingly large effort that they ran in Congress using Nazi funds and Nazi agents. And we now know that those members of Congress were powerful enough, they had friends in high enough places, that they used their own political influence to get themselves excused from accountability, to get the people who had found them out fired. So how does this help us in a national security context today? I have 2 points on that, and then I will sit down. The first point is this. It would be great to know why President Truman did what he did. Why fire that prosecutor? Why order the burial of that report on Americans who had been working with Nazi Germany? We do not know the answer to that for sure because President Truman never explained himself on this point. And depending on how you're feeling about President Truman at the moment, you can come up with a range of potential explanations that range from sort of very, very bad to not quite as bad. I think the worst case explanation was one that was offered by a crusading newspaper columnist at the time, Drew Pearson, who did actually break a lot of factual truth about this story at the time, but he also suggested in one of his columns that maybe President Truman ordered this prosecutor fired because of a grudge, because that prosecutor had also had a hand in prosecuting the old corrupt political boss in Missouri to whom Truman owed his start in politics. And I don't think there's any evidence to support that that was President Truman's motivation. I've looked into it, and I don't think it's there. But in the absence of any explanation to the contrary, that one did circulate in the press at the time, first with Drew Pearson and then more widely, and that itself is bad, right? Leaving that out there, not offering a contrary reasonable explanation, that does feed people's lowest suspicions about why the government takes the actions that it takes. Corruption is bad. The appearance of corruption is also bad in terms of breeding cynicism about our democratic form of government. Another only slightly less bad explanation is that President Truman fired the prosecutor and buried his report in order to protect his friend Senator Wheeler. This one I think there's strong support for. Senator Wheeler was Truman's friend. Senator Wheeler had been up to his neck in the Nazi scheme in Congress. Senator Wheeler was all over that prosecutor's report from Germany, and it was right after Senator Wheeler had met with Truman at the White House for 2 hours that Truman ordered the prosecutor fired. Senator Wheeler had also previously advocated to the Justice Department that they fire another prosecutor who had been working on this same investigation, which would make this the second time Senator Wheeler had used his political influence to get a prosecutor fired from this case, a case in which he himself was in the crosshairs for something very bad. And it's really bad that the Justice Department gave in to that kind of pressure that they did. And it's really, really bad that Senator Wheeler used that kind of pressure in the first place. It's also really bad if President Truman helped him do it. If President Truman's friendship with Senator Wheeler is why he did what he did, why he fired that prosecutor and buried that report, that is a conclusion that does not reflect well on President Truman. That said, there is also sort of a best-case scenario that you could conjure for him, which is that by late October 1946, when Truman had the prosecutor fired, the big marquee Nuremberg trials had actually just come to an end. The U.S. diplomat George Kennan had just sent his long telegram about the global ambitions of the USSR and the need for the United States to contain Soviet ambitions as a matter of existential importance. And so in pure national security terms, in late October 1946, maybe this wasn't the time to be prying open a big, ugly old can of worms about us and the Germans and Americans with ties and sympathies on the Nazi side, particularly Americans in our government. I mean, it was very shortly after the end of World War II, but we were on by then to fighting communism as our first imperative in what would soon be called the Cold War. That was a war in which we wanted West Germany to be on our side as an ally, and so maybe that informed Truman's decision as well. We don't know. We don't know because he never explained himself. We know from files at the Truman Library that the firestorm of press criticism over what Truman did, over him firing that prosecutor, it had a lot of resonance with the public. There are thick stacks of angry letters and telegrams from members of the public and little civic groups all over the country expressing disgust to the president that he had stood up for this terrible senator, Burt Wheeler, disgust and anger that Truman had fired the prosecutor, demands that President Truman reverse his decision and let the prosecutor's report be made public. President Truman never responded. He never explained himself. He just bore the firestorm and let it pass. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's fine if it's one ephemeral scandal during a long presidency with a lot going on. One little firestorm that rages in the moment, but then ends. If you think of national security challenges as one-off challenges, if you engage each one as unique, as a product of its time, as inexorably tied to specific contemporaneous context, never to be repeated, then that's fine. Let it blow over. Don't explain it if you do not have to. But maybe 80 years down the road, at the conference of the Truman Center for National Policy, maybe in a admittedly weird speech, some nerdy American newsperson with arcane interests will be poring over your decisions again, looking for some help from history for today. Because maybe 80 years down the road, our country will once again be contending with hard questions about whether it's in the national interest to criminally investigate and prosecute high-ranking, influential political figures. Maybe we will once again be contending with questions about whether a politician steeped in scandal and voted out of office, which Burton Wheeler was in 1946. Maybe we will be contending with whether that politician should be seen as punished enough by his political loss, or whether it would serve justice and the national interest to put him on trial for serious alleged crimes even after he left office. Maybe 80 years down the road, we'll be contending with questions of the propriety of Justice Department investigations into hostile foreign powers involving themselves with political contests and political figures in our own country. Maybe 80 years down the road, we will be facing what seem like new, hard questions about how much the public should be allowed to know about those investigations. What we should do with a report to the Attorney General laying out the findings of such a congressional investigation into a foreign power interfering in our elections and with our politics. When the Justice Department, under Roosevelt and under Truman, contended with ultra-right American zealots and paramilitary groups bent on overthrowing the U.S. government, and members of Congress who were sympathetic to them, coming to a Substack newsletter near you. As I was saying, when the Justice Department under Roosevelt and under Truman contended with ultra-right American zealots and paramilitary groups bent on overthrowing the U.S. government, and members of Congress who were sympathetic to them and didn't want them investigated or prosecuted, I'm sure they thought in the 1940s that that was a one-off, that that could never happen again. As such, government actions around those controversies, up to and including controversial orders by the president himself at the time, they went unexplained and undefended. Because I'm sure it seemed at the time those things were only of temporary interest, of temporary importance. They didn't need to stand the test of time. They were like buildings constructed just for the World's Fair. Who would ever think they'd still be standing? They'd still mean something to all of us all these years later. If we have learned nothing else in national security, let it be that there are no real one-offs. There are no black swan events. There was no one American fight against fascism. There will not be just one president or ex-president indicted. There have been many, and there will be more hostile foreign governments that, yes, interfered in our elections and in our politics. And there have been many, and there will be more Americans eager to help with that. Principled decision-making means not only responsibility to the full circumstances at hand in the moment. It also means there's a responsibility to the Americans 80 years from now who will be contending anew, contending again with something like this mess that we're in today. At the risk of calling out the pitchforks and the torches in this room, I will leave you with this. Don't be like Truman in this case. If you're going to do something really controversial, like firing that prosecutor and burying that red-hot report, please explain yourself. Your country needs you to. If not now, then 80 years down the road. Thank you.